This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 290, Building a Drupal Team. Welcome to Talking Drupal. This week we have a new guest host with us, and today they will be joining us to discuss building a Drupal team. What goes into selecting the right people? What makes a Drupal team successful? And how do you know when you got it right? Stay tuned for all those things and more. Good afternoon, listeners, or morning, or whenever you're listening to this. I'm John Picozzi, and today joining me for a 4-week stint here. You may know him from such podcasts as the Developing Up podcast, or if you're in the Boston area, maybe the Boston Drupal Meetup. He's also working with the three of us on the New England Drupal Camp. Joining us today and for the next couple episodes, Mike Miles. What's going on?
How's it going? I'm so excited to be here. One thing I wanted to share that I'm interested in that came out yesterday. Do you guys know anything about Cloudflare pages?
I saw something go by in our DevOps channel or engineering channel, but yeah, tell us more.
So, not really Drupal related, right? But so Cloudflare pages is now generally available. And what those are, if you know what GitHub pages are, basically it's it's a Jamstack that you can host on GitHub. Cloudflare, it's the same thing. It allows you a free way and a secure way and a fast way to host, build, host, and collaborate on Jamstack sites. So I don't know much about how it works. I still think it's really cool, though.
Does it just pull it out of a Git
Yeah,
repo?
It pulls out of a Git repo. You just have to set up like a Git commit and a Git push, and it reads from it somehow. And then you get feedback. You get a scalable Cloudflare page, hosted on Cloudflare somehow. And then you get analytics with it. So I thought it was a really cool implementation I've always talked about hosting my personal website using GitHub pages or now Cloudflare pages. So
that's super interesting because my son's got a website that we're working on and I have it on GitHub pages right now, but I could be persuaded to move it. And I also buried the lead. Mike is the director of web development at MIT Sloan, which is he's repping the brand right.
I'm wearing
there.
the swag.
If you're watching the video, so you can find out more about that on LinkedIn, I'm sure. Moving into the usuals. Nick, what's going on with you?
Not too much this week. It's starting to warm up a little bit, so my garden is starting to come out. I've got all my daffodils are out. My tulips are starting to come up. My hostas started peeking out. My garden's turning green. Getting excited, and hoping. And some of the things that we planted last year have come back. It's always a question if the winter's going to kill something in New England.
I have that problem myself right now. One of my gardens, when we first moved in, we planted a whole bunch of stuff that would come up every year, and I think we're down to two or three things this year. So
it's that weird frost that can hit that kills anything that starts to grow.
It's funny. Nick said it was getting warmer, and I think yesterday it was just over 40 degrees. So I'm like, yeah, getting warmer. Moving on though, Steven, tell us about your latest invention.
Hey, before I do that, I wonder if you guys have cut your grass yet.
So
mine needs one before the weekend. I can see it.
No, I have not yet cut my grass, but I'm going to go into this. It's going to be a little rabbit hole here.
Okay. Sorry.
If you fertilize your grass, Scott's has a great program where they will literally get dimensions of your lawn and then mail you the fertilizer that you need when you need it. And then there's a little app on your phone and it'll tell you when to apply it. And cool. Yeah, it is totally cool because if you use a service like TrueGreen, it's ridiculously expensive. And I don't mind putting the stuff in the spreader and spreading it myself. But the reason I bring that up is because I was looking at my lawn thinking, I got to mow my lawn before I apply the fertilizer, which is going to be in the next couple of weeks. So
did it already arrive?
Yeah. It came a couple of weeks ago. They usually send it to you 3 or 4 weeks before you need to apply it.
Yeah.
So you have a smart lawn.
Sort of. What I really want to get is one of those lawn mowing robots. you seen one of those? They're
Yeah,
really
they're like $1,500.
Yeah, no,
I've
they're
looked
not
at them.
cheap. That's why I don't have one. But like, it seems pretty cool. But I also imagine that like one day it just ends up getting lost and you never see it again.
It seems like a
They have-
scary
no,
Roomba. I mean,
Well, they have GPS, so because they're so expensive, they're
Is this
pretty
like a
easy to recover,
Roomba? A
apparently.
Roomba? For
Yeah.
the yard?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, but
Okay.
I don't. If I remember correctly, they don't use blades, so they're almost like a weed whacker. A lot of them, because
Okay.
you're right, like a spinning metal blade that's unattended in the
Have you ever
yard.
seen Battle Bots? It's the same
Would-
same thing, just for your lawn.
But the research I've done, I think they seem pretty cool. But yeah, a little bit out of the range of something I'll pick up just to tinker with.
Speaking of tinkering with things, Stephen, do you want to talk about the latest thing you're tinkering with, or are you good?
Yeah, no. So I've been, as everyone knows, I've been playing with Raspberry Pis for 6 months and coding them and soldering them and doing all kinds of stuff. And I got this little device this week. I'll put it in the camera. It's like that big. It's a little tiny USB microcontroller that I got from Adafruit, and it allowed me to put my program that I wrote that shakes my mouse. We talked about that in the past, right? Did we?
Yes.
Yeah, my mouse shaking program. And it allows me to like put it onto this little device, put it into the USB port, and it's got these little touch sensors on it on the edge where you can turn it on and off. The idea is that, when I'm on my computer and I don't want the computer to fall asleep, I just touch the edge and the little LEDs light up, and it keeps my mouse shaking. So it's pretty cool. I've gone from, again, this is for people on the computer screen. I kind of put this together with some soldering about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Was my first attempt at like building something with a button on the top. And then I've moved, I moved to this little device here. So
Couple of things on that. If you are watching the video, you'll know that you'll see that the casing for that is actually a pill bottle.
yeah,
And if you've listened to the show before, the last time we talked about this project, we said that Stephen might not want to get onto an airplane with said device. The version 2.0 looks much more airplane friendly, by the way.
it is. It's a lot of fun. So I've been doing Python coding and playing with these little things. It's just a lot of fun.
I don't know if that's more airplane friendly though. You touch it and it starts blinking red. I mean, people.
Well, I'm not saying you're going to use it on an
this.
airplane. I'm just saying that you got to get on an airplane with it when that becomes a thing again. Cool. Well,
How about
that's
you, John? What's up?
It's interesting to see you playing with those things. Yeah. So found out just Monday, the first thing that I did at Drupalcon was I went to the Pantheon booth, and they were talking about migrating from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 on Pantheon, which is now a thing that you can do.
Really?
Yes, they have a migration path. There is I'll put a link in the show notes to the walkthrough that they have for that. But they were talking about it, and the more and more I listened, I'm thinking that I might just rebuild my Drupal site on a Pantheon Drupal 9 upstream, and then port over my database and reinstall my modules and whatnot. So
What is it about the migration that makes you think you don't want to migrate?
well, you can't really right now, right? You still have to.
I think John's saying that you can now.
yeah, there is a path. They have a tutorial on how to migrate from 8 to 9. So yeah, you can do it. I just I don't know. I'm a little anal retentive, and I like nice clean things. So I figure if I plus I think I've botched my Composer installation, because I was using Composer with Drupal 8, but it doesn't really work with. So the Pantheon, the 9 version, the upstream builds with Composer already. So that stuff's already there. So like I'm just starting fresh. That's what I'm going with. I'm starting fresh. What?
I think I lost you for a second. You didn't cut out for you guys?
Nope.
No, but it says you're muted and I can still hear you, which is weird.
Interesting. So maybe that's on my side then. Sorry.
Nick needs another new computer.
Nick needs Linux machines are great, but you have to buy 25 of them before you get one that works.
and you still come out ahead compared to Mac.
Maybe.
So
go
ahead.
Sorry, was somebody going to ask a question? Because I was just going to move on. No.
Yeah, I mean, I did have a quick question. Were the composer issues with like Composer 2 versus 1 on Pantheon? Is that the?
No, I mean, I wasn't having Composer issues, but I was using Composer with Drupal 8, which wasn't supported on Pantheon. So basically, I was just like using Composer locally. But now with the Drupal 9 upstream, from what I understand, it's using Composer to build. So like when you push, there's going to be a build step that's going to build your thing, so you don't have to actually store all of the module files.
Which is really cool. You no longer have to build the artifact and push it to Pantheon. But I imagine a lot of people are going to have to change their CI workflows for that.
Yes, because this is my personal project. I don't have such complicated CI workflows. So, I'm looking forward to maybe an update next week if I get time to play with that this weekend. But speaking of
CI workflows,
maybe. DrupalCon. Right. So DrupalCon's happening this week. I know Mike is attending. I think I saw Steven in Hoppin just today. So I know that he's there too. We're on, day 2 now. We just wrapped up. And I'm going to actually open it up to you guys. Are there any sessions or BOFs that stood out to you so far?
Mike, you go first. How did your CI?
Yeah, so I ran, it was a BOF, which when having it presented as a BOF was a little bit of a challenge, but I had a BOF on continuous integration and deployment with Drupal, and it went really well. I think there was like 275 people from the conference that I saw came to it. And
oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was
275 in the BOF?
Yeah, that's what I'd said, I think.
That's like a quarter of the attendance today, I think.
I think that's maybe I read the numbers wrong. There are a number of people there. It was really engaging.
There were a lot of people in a lot of rooms. Brian Perry went to his talk today, and there were like 400 and some odd people in the room.
Wow.
It was nuts. Sorry.
It was great. No, that's fine. I mean, so it was fun. We had a lot of different people giving their perspectives on their experience with different tools and, GitHub Actions or, Bitbucket pipelines, Acquia pipelines, Jenkins, like it ran the gamut and different experiences. So the hour went by really quick, which I think is a good sign for a BOF. It wasn't dragging at all.
Did anything come out as a winner or a clear superior product?
No, we talked a lot about GitHub Actions though, and how easy it is, but there was definitely different camps between GitLab and GitHub. People also tried to talk about tabs versus spaces and then which IDE was best, which as a facilitator, I tried to dial those back because
you're like,
there's
okay,
a lot of opinions. Yeah.
You're like, okay, nerds, listen, we're
just like, no, I didn't want to start those wars. So, but people were engaged. So it was good. I enjoyed it.
Cool. Mike, do you know if the BOF was recorded? I know
it said it was recording it, so we'll find out. I know the Hopin platform I find a little frustrating to be honest, but
really,
yeah, I don't know. But I applaud the Drupal Association, for getting a virtual thing out there. So
it's funny because I really enjoy the Hopin platform. I went to a conference I think actually Mike and I went to the same conference a couple of weeks ago, and I did not love their platform.
It was Mike's favorite, by the way.
No way. Come on. No, it wasn't. You're pulling my leg. Steven, what about you? Anything stand out to you?
No, not so far. I think I've been more engaged in the networking than the sessions. I think just because of my schedule, I'm still working during the day, so I'm kind of jumping in and out, but I've found myself kind of jumping into these networking tracks a little bit and chatting with people. Doing
like the hallway tracks, or
did the hallway tracks, and I also did the like dial a date thing where you kind of
how do you like that? That seems scary to me. Just you don't know who you're going to connect with, and
it's scary, but my experience in it has been really good. I encourage everyone to go in there and push that button, give it a try. So anyone who doesn't know, it's a room you go into and you push a button and it connects you with somebody randomly. and you talk with them for a period of time, and then it disconnects you unless you keep the talk going. You get connected to someone else. So I call it like speed dating, but it's really sort of an interesting concept.
I just feel like there's so many things that could go wrong with that. But
no,
but you could connect to Dries, right? He said in his
actually,
he was going to do it.
Yeah, he was actually
give it a try.
He was actually in there quite a bit last year, from what I understand. Yeah, for me, I think there have been some interesting talks. I think a lot of the diversity and inclusion talks have been really great and really eye-opening. So, yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, Brian Perry did a talk about Gatsby, their using of Gatsby on the Bounteous site, and that was great. Really informative as well. So I think all around there have been some good talks. It's interesting. They're taking a different approach this year than they have in the past, where the overarching initiatives are basically getting like a day. So today was the decoupled menus initiative, which you can listen a couple episodes ago. We had those folks on to talk about that. And all of the subsequent session, or not all of them, most of the subsequent sessions were kind of about decoupling and that sort of thing. So tomorrow is the out of the box initiative, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what types of sessions go along with that.
It's funny, John, you mentioned that, because when I was it was either when I was speed dating or in a room today, just chatting, I said, boy, this conference seems to be focused on decoupled. All the sessions are decoupled. And someone explained to me, oh, that's because today's the decoupled day. If you come tomorrow, it's the such and such day. And then the next day is the other day. So it's an interesting idea, but it'd be good to tell people that ahead of time. Or maybe I missed it.
No, I don't. Cause I've been looking at the schedule for the last couple of days, and I only really just realized that was actually what was happening today when somebody pointed it out to me. So, I think, overall, I think the Drupal Association is doing a great job. I have some frustrations with the schedule and like things overlapping in a weird way, but there'll be a survey and I will let them know about that. So let's jump into our primary topic, which is building a Drupal team, right? So I think we all have worked on Drupal teams. Some of us have run Drupal teams, and those teams tend to have different dynamics and have different people responsible for different things. So today, as I said in our intro, our goal is going to be to kind of define what goes into selecting the right people and the right roles for your team, and then how do you define success for that team? Like how do we know that we have the right team in place? So, first and foremost, I think obviously the biggest part of any team is the people, right? And the roles that you're filling on that team.
Yeah. So even though we're talking about building a Drupal team for obviously Drupal projects, not every role for a successful project has to be Drupal specific. So if you're looking at building out a team, you want to make sure that you build out, people that have skills in different areas. So you'll definitely want a project manager. We had a few episodes ago, we had Matt O'Brien on. He talked about being a digital project manager, episode 286. On the Drupal side, I always think it's important, on the larger projects, you want to have somebody who's an architect who can help plan out how to build things, give advice on which modules to use, maybe even build out some proof of concepts, and just really kind of highlight areas that will be difficulties or integration points.
And I would say, just going back to the project manager for a second, Nick, I would say, like, how important do you guys think it is to have a project manager? Like we referenced the episode with Matt about digital project managers, but how important do you think it is to have a project manager that kind of understands the inner workings of Drupal?
I mean, in my experience, having what I've always called a technical project manager it can be very beneficial, because if you act as that that architect or a tech lead and you need help, like if you work in an agency explaining things to the client, having a project manager who has some understanding of the platform can be very helpful in those conversations. And they also won't promise something that's impossible for if you're the technical person, have to be the bad guy to say like,
yep,
can't do this. So
yeah, I agree with that, Mike. And I've actually found that sometimes they can help alleviate some of the like low hanging fruit from your plate, right? If there's like a client reaches out and says, "Hey, we noticed this content needs to be changed," if they're if they're skilled in the CMS, in Drupal, they can go in and they can easily make that change and not have to put a ticket in and go through that whole cycle. So yeah.
Or at least being able to speak the language and knowing the terminology. So knowing when you say it's a taxonomy or it's a content type, like they know what you're talking about. That can be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The thing is, there's some things in this list that you have to have Drupal experience to do, right? You can't architect a Drupal website without having Drupal experience. The project manager having Drupal experience is a huge positive. I don't know that would be a requirement for every project. I mean, I've worked with really skilled project managers before in projects, and it takes them, 2 or 3 weeks to pick up that lingo, and if they're good technical project managers already, they're not promising things that they don't know about. So yeah, it's definitely, I think project management, that's one of those ones where Drupal experience is a bonus, not necessarily a requirement. On the Drupal side, again, though, this is another one that I think, again, Drupal experience is helpful, but really, really helpful, but not really a requirement. I mean, if you have somebody who's good at figuring stuff out and a quick learner, they can pick up a lot of this stuff pretty quickly. But Drupal has this concept of site builder, and they're kind of the people that are like pointing and clicking. They might be the ones that actually create the content types, or they might create taxonomies. They might create some views even, or they'll be creating views, those kinds of things. I've worked on projects where people have come from other CMSs, and they very quickly can get onboarded. But a really big Drupal project, especially in the early stages of either migration, upgrade, something like that, it definitely needs somebody usually who's dedicated to site building.
And that's interesting, Nick, because I think back when I was a Drupal architect, I did a lot of site building, and we didn't necessarily always have a dedicated site builder on a project team. Actually, I would venture to say we very rarely had a dedicated site builder. We have an architect, and then a lot of times the front end dev might do some site building as well, depending on
really
changing of the the layout of something. So for example, views is a big area where front end dev would jump in and kind of move things around and kind of change some of that site building aspect. But yeah, typically, I would say that it's great if you can build a team with a site builder. I think that's awesome, but sometimes that burden can be shared by other team members.
It's funny because in teams I've run in the past, I agree with you that the role of site builder is usually shared across different other roles. I've always been in my experience that the front end developer tends to be the one who's not doing the site building. They seem a bit more removed because they can, especially with tools nowadays, don't really have to dig into Drupal. But anyone who does like the back end development or the architecture, they tend to be the site builders. That's my experience.
It's interesting. Experiences may vary, right?
Yeah. I kind of lean towards Mike when it's more shared on my side. It's usually the developers, the back end developers doing that, or the architect, than the front end developers. Now, some really experienced front end developers will know things like display suite, like they'll figure out how to put a class somewhere, but they're usually not rebuilding stuff.
Yeah, we see a little bit more involvement too around layout builder. Where
I can see that
layouts are being built, and like there are elements within the theme within Drupal that are being referenced in in templates?
So the next role, this is another role that, again, you can have people kind of jump in that don't have a lot of Drupal experience, but I think this is one of the more dangerous ones to have somebody that doesn't have Drupal experience. And that's kind of the custom development aspect, the actual developers. Drupal, especially with Drupal 8, Drupal 9, it's gotten much more friendly to non-Drupal developers. It's object-oriented now. It's built on Symfony, so it's much easier to jump in. I think this role is a little less dangerous than the Drupal 7 days, where you could always tell when a site was built by a PHP developer, because they always had these random includes everywhere. But having somebody who knows the Drupal API and kind of how Drupal interacts with plugins and stuff can be a real time saver, especially on the maintenance side. I mean, once you kind of move from building to maintenance, if somebody didn't follow general Drupal principles and best practices, introducing new features or fixing bugs can become a real time sink. Then we have the next role is kind of another unique-ish Drupal role, and that's the theming side. So again, this is with Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, this has become a bit more standard to kind of industry. But there's still some Drupal quirks to how the Drupal theming system works. And if you want your front-end design developers to do some of the integration work, they'll definitely need to know some Drupal fundamentals. I do work with a few clients where that is completely divorced. Like they have their front-end developers just generate components and twig templates and styles, and then all the integration happens with the backend developer. Mm-hmm. But I do still see a lot of people that the front-end developers are doing the integration.
So Nick, I was going to ask you about that. So in that scenario, if you have front-end themers that don't know Drupal, do you find that the people doing like the custom backend work are doing the twig updates and that kind of stuff, template updates? Like who's doing that in that case?
It kind of varies a little bit, but the ones that is completely divorced are usually using a design system like Pattern Labs.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a twig file. They generate a twig file that has the HTML that they need. They have a JSON file that has the data they need. So when it comes time to integration, you're really just saying.
So who's figuring out all those quirks, like when you use Pattern Lab of the data, the stuff not showing up where you expect it to, or you need to make template changes? That's the Drupal backend guy.
Yeah, right. Usually. Because the front end guy just puts what the spec says, and then you just have to figure out how to get the data into the template.
That's where I feel there's two different types of front end Drupal teammates. There are the themers who know like for how Drupal does templating, and then there are front end developers who will use like Pattern Lab to build out those twig components that then they give to the themers, which could be the backend developer also, and they're plugging in basically from the output from Drupal into your component templates, which I think in previous versions of Drupal, like Drupal 7 and Drupal 6, before we moved to Twig, it was definitely more of the like front end developer builds their thing separately and they give it to the back end developer to plug everything in, because you had to know Drupal to plug it in.
Yeah. It's super interesting. We just finished a project with Pattern Lab, and the back-end developer was working on custom modules, working on migrations. The front-end developer was working on anything theme related. So like taking the components from Pattern Lab, getting them into Twig templates, building out the CSS, all of that stuff. So yeah, it's interesting you bring that up.
I mean, I think one of the huge benefits is the problem with Drupal 7 and before, if the front-end developer built it separately in their own system, when it came time for the theme or somebody to integrate that, there would be changes to that template or to that CSS, and things would break. One of the nice things about the Pattern Lab and the Twig system that Drupal has now is, for example, say the two workflows are completely divorced from each other. So if the designer decides that they want to add some bobble to some card, the front end person just adds whatever data point that they need to add to get that to work. And then when the back end person comes back to integrate it, they go, oh, I need a field to trigger that, or I need the language, the current language of the site to display there. And you just create a variable and put it there. Like, you don't have to worry about, like, there were so many times where, you know, in order to reduce integration problems, you would kind of mock up a content type or something like that for the designer. And then for the front end developer, the designer would come back with a change. Well, now the developer has to retweak the mockup so that the front end developer can work again. And then there's still issues when you integrate. And with Drupal 8, I find that, you know, there are exceptions. Like, I find menus sometimes still have some integration problems, and certain blocks still have integration problems. But by and large, it's really just, you find the right template to pull from in Drupal. You might massage the data a little bit in a pre-process function, and then you just include it, and it works perfectly. So yeah, there's still something to be said for them to have some Drupal experience, but it's far less important than it used to be. Now, just really quickly, there are a few other things that any project needs, more or less. You know, you do need somebody front end, you know, whether that's whether they know Drupal or not. You need a DevOps role. Again, many times it's the developer doing that, but they need to know, somebody needs to get the site up to production and set up environments and that kind of thing. You do need a designer. Somebody needs to provide what the site should look like. And ideally, you have a UX and a QA team. So you have somebody telling you, like, hey, this is how users interact with the site, and this is the way we make their journey better. And then QA obviously catches all the mistakes.
And it's interesting because these are all labeled under non-Drupal, but again, I'd be willing to say that your DevOps person and your UX person knowing Drupal, and what I mean by knowing is like knowing in their domain, right? Like what a server needs for Drupal to run, what the CI pipeline needs, like a cache clear or a config import in order for the site to build properly. Or on the UX side, knowing like, hey, if I have like this set of filters and it has this button, the button's not going to be like on the other side of the page because that's going to be really annoying for the the team to build. So, as much as they could be, non-Drupal folks, it's good for them to kind of know how Drupal operates or what Drupal's expecting, right?
So we've listed, if I add them up here, it's somewhere around 12 or 14 different skills roles that you'd need to build a Drupal team. And I imagine some people are sitting out there thinking, I don't have room for 12 or 14 people on my team.
Can I ask how you got to 12 or 14? I'm counting 10.
2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Well, I got 12.
While we're counting, let's just quickly recap them. So, because we kind of went through them without listing them. So we've got project manager, architect, site building, custom development, Drupal themer, front-end developer, DevOps, design, UX, and QA. Which is 10, by
John,
the way.
Okay, John, 10. The exact number wasn't my point, by the way. So my point being that there's a difference between resources that you have available and roles and skills. So I'm kind of curious on your thoughts on how you combine maybe skills and roles into resources. So you might have one person that's doing multiple roles or skills. So how would you mix and match these that we have in our list of 10 items?
I mean, one we already brought up is almost anybody in site building, right? Yep. The site building task gets split across the different people of the team. And I'd say also
including the PM, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I'd also say, in my experience, the architect also does a lot of the custom development as well. Like they may be a lead developer because they know so much that they know the APIs to do. So those are kind of shared roles as well.
I mean, the way I generally see it is usually it's split into 3 buckets. And if you start to combine those 3 buckets, projects become a lot more difficult. So usually project management is generally standalone. If you have like a developer or a designer or somebody like that doing project management, they're not going to be handling all the project management tasks, or they're not going to be handling all the design tasks. Like project management is its own beast. What I call the development bucket, that that includes like architecture, site building, custom development, that kind of thing, and design. I mean, you do have some people that can design and develop, but again, unless it's a smaller project, you can't have one person doing all the design and all the development and all the front end development. So if you have a smaller team, you can share roles between people, but you probably want somebody more dedicated towards design, somebody more dedicated towards development tasks, and somebody more dedicated towards project management.
Yeah, I tend to agree with all that. Project manager's a project manager. Like you can't combine that. Granted, they could be a site builder. I think we've seen on projects a combination of like a project lead, right, which is usually a back-end developer who is doing the architecture work in some cases, and then sharing that site building task. And then when you get down to, we have a DevOps engineer outside of the team itself. But when you get down to design and UX, that's usually the designer, the design UX person. The QA person is interesting because we don't actually have specific QA people. We go through a bug bash process that includes both the project team and people from other project teams. So there isn't necessarily a specific QA person. So that's an area where you can typically save.
However, you should not have a developer be a QA for their own work. Right?
Oh, no.
Yeah, and something else too, John mentioned that he says lead developers are often project managers. That's another thing that seems like a red flag to me.
Did I say that? I did not mean that.
Okay.
I don't know that I said that. I said project managers are on their own. Lead developers or project leads are usually doing the architecture work.
Okay, yeah, maybe I misunderstood project lead as project manager.
Yeah, I find that developers make terrible project managers. And, I've always said if I were to hire somebody, the first person I would hire would be a project manager, probably, even if it was just part-time. Because once they start taking a whole lot of other responsibilities, aside from like maybe site building, that kind of stuff, the project management just suffers enough that it usually just means things don't get done.
But I think that can change based off of the different phase you are for your team in the Drupal projects, because there's 2 basic phases, right? There's the development phase for a team, and then the maintenance phase, and there are 2 different structures for the team, I would say, for that. Because when you're in development, you need a lot more of these roles, and I think, like you said before, Nick, you need a lot more dedicated. Like you have someone during development who's figuring out the design and the UX, who's building the front end. You have the architect who's planning the technical implementation and, probably dictating to the rest of the development team what to do for the custom development, the site building, and the theming. And during that phase, everyone's kind of focused on the one thing and what they need to do to get to, quote, launch. But then when you move to maintenance, where it's really about fine tuning and bug fixing, I think someone who's an architect or a lead dev, if they stay on the project, then since everything's built, you don't have to architect as much stuff, but you can lead more of a project, not from a project manager, but more of a project management not ideal, what I want. I don't know. Be more like a project manager, a technical project manager, because then you're taking the bugs, you're figuring out, all right, who can I give this to? Who can take this on based on the other skill sets in the team? Because you're not doing as much of that architecture.
It's interesting. There was a talk at Drupalcon yesterday, I think it was, about building Drupal teams, and they had some great visuals as far as like how like your initial team looks versus like the maintenance team that comes in after the fact, right? And I think Mike just did a great job of highlighting those changes. I think a couple of additions maybe that come into the team after a project's launched is maybe somebody, on the marketing side of things, or maybe looking at like analytics and insights from the site to see what the next feature set is or what the next phase is, right? But you're also people are kind of fading into the background, like your DevOps folks or your architects, right, that aren't necessarily needed when the site's kind of humming along and doing its thing.
So in that vein, let's say we built a new Drupal 9 site. It launched yesterday. What does a team look like if you were planning it moving forward? You probably don't need the design person, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think
probably, what would be the key skills of that list of 10 that we have? What would you say would be the important ones that you would need for that maintenance?
Project manager, definitely, to be able to manage that backlog. And then depending on what the backlog looks like, you could easily run with a back end and front end developer and just kind of knock out those tasks, right? There's not a lot of and it depends, it depends on a couple of things. Like, is the backlog full of bug fixes? If it's feature enhancements, you might need to bring that architect or that design talent back in to kind of solve some of those, but they become very much task specific as opposed to like overall project specific.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like projects over the last 5 or 6 years have moved more towards that living application model, where you launch and you kind of move to maintenance, but maintenance is a lot of little phases. Drupal 7, you would have this big push, you'd build something and then you wouldn't touch it for 6 months. You just have like minor content fixes, bug fixes, migration, like little things going on. But with Drupal 8, 9, other projects, like it's much more, hey, we're rebuilding the brand, we're rebranding, we're getting everything up, but then we're adding this feature in, then we're integrating with this service. And so I do see a lot of people have that, they have a team, like it may not be as developer heavy or as architect heavy, but they definitely have a designer, they have a project manager, they have a couple of developers maintaining everything. And then the DevOps is really just about fine tuning or solving additional problems or, giving more flexibility to the developers.
But Nick, I like your point about, nowadays after you launch, that's not the end date of a website, right? That's the beginning of a whole new phase, like you said, and it's a living thing that keeps on building. So one of the roles we didn't mention that probably comes to play, and they're not Drupal specific, but will be like an analytics person. So if I assume you have analytics on your Drupal project, and you're tracking user behavior and you're figuring out how people are using your site and then thinking about how you're going to improve it for them, getting that analytic data and then pulling that into your backlog and designing new features or functionality or changing things. So that's where it's like you constantly have to keep working on it so it's relevant for your users.
The other role we didn't mention, and it's probably an 11 or 12, would be if you're doing translation, you do have translation resources related to project planning and content translation.
I mean, that's a whole like editorial team because someone's got to fill that role.
Right. So you might have a content person or for us, we usually bring in a freelancer or a contractor to help with that. So here's a question. When you are building a team, you obviously we talked about roles and skills that you want, but do you think that those roles and skills change depending on the type of organization that you are? And what I mean by that is, if you're a digital services firm like Oomph, or you are a corporate or government team, or maybe an organization, right, a nonprofit or an educational institution, does your team makeup change based on the type of organization that you are?
100%.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I mean, just the example you just gave, editorial team. I mean, 9 times out of 10, that's on the customer side. Like, or if some corporations have a web development team, so they have developers, but they'll have an editorial team too. It's not often that the agency has, except for maybe an initial migration or population type thing, they're not usually managing, the day-to-day edits or content generation.
And I mean, would you guys agree that for a firm or agency, it's probably more, people are probably more specialized in what they do, as opposed to a corporate team or an organizational team where you may be interested in, as we kind of combined those roles, as we were talking about them, looking for somebody that kind of checks off those multiple boxes?
So I can say from practical experience, so I've been at MIT Sloan now for only a year. And before that, for the 11 years before that, I was at a digital agency. I led the Drupal team, and then I was the VP of technology. And those teams, it was about, for the client websites, it was about having the team, like you were saying, of specialized people who could fill these certain roles of front-end development, design, UX, QA, back-end development, architecture, and getting that site to launch. And like Nick said, it wasn't really about us writing the content. Though at my agency, we did have editorial writers. Now being at Sloan, we have an agency partner who's helped build the website that's on Drupal 8 right now, and get it to launch and design it for us and launch it. And then this past year, and since before I came on, it was about building an internal team to take over that long-term maintenance. Mm-hmm. And so my team, who I lead, they're not as they're a little more diverse in terms of they're a little more diverse in what they can do in terms of, we don't have a specific front end developer. We have someone who they handle most of the front end, but they also take on back end development as well, because my team's a little more lean. But at the same time, we're growing our skills so that we can slowly phase out the need to have an agency partner.
I think it also depends on the type of organization too, because a lot of organizations like Mike, your organization, or some corporate clients that I have, their main purpose isn't web related or technology related. Yep. Like the website is in addition to it. So the team will generally be a bit smaller. And like I said, Mike, they'll be more diverse. People have to take on what needs to be done. But I do have I've had clients that were tech focused, and some of their products were like, the website was the product or the application. And they had incredibly they had some people that the only thing that they did was manage infrastructure on AWS. In fact, they had 2 or 3 people that did that. They had some people that the only thing they did was design for these 2 projects, and other people that designed for another project. So they're internal, but they're like very, very defined roles.
It's interesting. It's interesting, Nick, because I feel like this industry is always on that roller coaster of like agency partner versus internal team. And I just heard something the other day that more companies are hiring internal teams to manage these types of projects instead of contracting with agencies, which I always think is interesting, because I'm like, we're on that up or that down, depending on how you look at it.
You can always tell when that's happening in a project. Like I know now from both sides, being on the agency side, when it started to tip that your client is kind of moving away from you, and you kind of expect it. And being on the client side now, knowing that like keeping this agency on costs a lot of money. And so is it cost effective to build our own team internally for our long-term strategic needs?
So, Mike, that was my question to you. What is the driving force behind building an internal team? Is it funding?
Some of it's funding, yeah. And I think for sure, it definitely is, because like I just said, keeping an agency partner, if you have a really good one, it costs money. It costs can cost a lot of money. And versus, hiring contractors or internal teams, which, we can talk about. That's definitely a driving factor, but also the point that Nick made before about as on an agency, like your developers, they're who you're, they're your product, they're who you're selling. Like that's what you do. Where if you work, say like higher ed, the development team that's not the product that's being sold. They're just supporting it. So building that internal team that can know the business better and be ingrained with it and can do more with less to prompt the mission of the organization is definitely helpful.
Yeah. I mean, also another reason why companies will use an agency for the initial build out too is because an initial build out is a lot of work and takes a lot of resources, but it's usually fairly short term, might be a year, might be 2 years. But, as a company, it's very hard to hire 2 or 3 people and basically be like, well, you're only going to be here for 2 years, because once you're done with your job, you're fired.
Right. Yeah.
And then, because you might need 8 or 10 people to build the site, but you might only need 2 people to maintain it. So hiring an agency, it's like, well, the agency's job is to keep their pipeline full, but so you're not really firing them when the project's over. It's just the agency has another project lined up after that.
And so that's where you kind of have to balance for your organization, your agency, what have you, having in-house resources versus external resources, or if you're outsourcing, thinking about long-term what you actually need, because you don't need to buy that whole team to build your website and keep them on forever. You just need a strategic team to maintain and enhance your website or your Drupal project.
You don't need that on-staff content creator if every other project requires content creation.
Right.
Yeah. So let's speak about outsourcing for a minute. So I think in this day and age, we've all worked with outsourced talent, probably on both sides of the coin. So I think it's a big question. How do you make sure that you're going to be successful when you outsource? And I've worked with multiple teams. I've worked on projects where the outsourced team was a nightmare to work with. And I've worked with on some projects where the outsourced team was fantastic and very productive. So I've over the years, I've learned a couple of things that really, if you're thinking about outsourcing, you really want to keep in mind to make sure that that your outsourced project is successful. And the first thing is to consider what should you be outsourcing. You do want to be outsourcing, obviously, things that you don't have internal talent for. But I think it's also important sometimes to have a little bit, outsource some of the stuff that you do have expertise in, because if you have no expertise in something, it's very difficult for you to quality check that and make sure that the outsourced team is providing something of value. Whereas if you have something that you are an expert in, you can at least have some sort of barometer to check and make sure that things are going well.
I agree with that, Nick. I think an example that comes to my head is you want to have like that technical architect, someone who really knows Drupal on your team, and then you may be able to outsource like the back end development. And if you need to quickly scale that up, it's easier to outsource it and then have that lead technical person being able to review that work and check it to know it's being done correctly, versus hiring a whole bunch of back end developers for like a single project.
Yeah, I would never outsource a tech lead or an architect on a project, right? Because that's just paving a road with a disaster. But in some instances, we've been asked to come in as a design UX resource for a technical team that has the ability to build something, but doesn't have the ability to design it or to maybe it's more of an accessibility audit of some sort. So, I think there are definitely areas where you can reach out to companies and bring them in to help strengthen your team.
So the 2 other really kind of concrete things that I found really make this helpful. Yeah, you probably don't want to outsource your main technical architect, but you do want to make sure that you minimize the points of contact that you have. Ideally, you have somebody on your team that's fairly dedicated to communication with the outsourced team.
Like
and ideally,
manager.
Can be a project manager, but I've worked with companies where the different projects have their own project managers, and then there's one dedicated project manager that communicates with offshore. So each individual project gives a work order to the offshore project manager, and then they're the ones that handle queuing stuff up for the offshore team. And it's good for them to have a counterpart on the other side. That's a little less critical, but it's definitely a positive. And I find I'm working with a team right now that's fantastic. They have our point of contact with the outsourced team is a technical architect. Like that's his role. His time is far more expensive than the general developer's time. But I find having those weekly or daily stand-ups, depending on what cycle we're in with him, and explaining the issue and not having to have those back and forths with the offshore team for questions. I mean, I essentially generate some tickets, go over them with him, make sure he understands them. And then 2 or 3 days later, I have the tickets fixed with a PR for me to review. Just having that endpoint, like they have a question on how to do something. They need a proof of concept or something. He's handling all that communication. And I mean, like I said, he's a bit more pricey than the other developers, but he's worth every penny because it makes that process much more streamlined.
So I think something to note there, and just a couple things here, is like you have to define kind of your outsourcing strategy, right? Are you going to embed a person into your team, and they're going to be, for example, content creator, or a developer? Like, are they going to be an embedded part of your team, or are you just like kind of throwing things over the fence to an offshore team that is working for you? I think when you're embedding somebody, you're looking for a contractor to be embedded into your team. You definitely want to make sure you're getting buy-in from the team and having key team members, meet with that person to make sure it's a good fit and they're going to be able to work well together. And I think as far as the contractor side of things, we had an episode with Chad Hester about becoming a successful contractor. And in there, we talk a lot about, dynamics and how to pick the right person. So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. So when you're building a Drupal team, with anything, right, there can be challenges. What do you guys think are some of the challenges when building a Drupal team? And one that comes to mind right now is, when people decide to leave your Drupal team. But I'm wondering if there are others that are kind of like ringing around in your head as I ask this question.
I was thinking about the difficulty of knowing how many of each role you need. So like, how many backend developers do you need for this project? How many front end? Usually you have like one architect, but how many of each do you need? I mean, it's hard to gauge from the initial scope of a project what that is. And you kind of have to, in my experience, fumble around the first few days to figure it out, unless you have a very specific size team at your disposal and that's who you have. But that's a challenge that comes to my mind, is knowing how many cooks to have in the kitchen.
Do you have any recommendations for that, Mike?
I would say, like I just said, one technical architect. You need someone who sets the technical path. Maybe during the development phase, 2 back-end developers, and then maybe 2 front-end developers, depending on the scope of the project. And then scale that back in the maintenance to have one of each role.
So we have squads, and we got this. We took this model from Shopify, and on a squad you typically have a project manager, front end developer, 1 or 2 front end developers, and 1 or 2 back end developers, and that squad then has the ability to lean on other squads if there's, if they have, they need more resources, to say like, hey, do you guys have any cycles available that you can kind of give to us to help with that project? So that's, that can be another good method to kind of handling that problem, where the squad starts off, and then as they get going, they kind of figure out like, okay, we need more people to help out with this.
The challenge that jumps out to me is finding Drupal resources. And I know there's no answer for that, but it seems like they're hard to find. And John, I know that you guys are constantly looking for resources there. So
we are. And if you're looking for a job, you should go to umfink.com/careers.
I can't believe we had to wait this long in the show for John to plug that. But
Mike, have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, definitely. Being back, in my agency days, trying to hire for my team, and
Right.
even now, I'm getting ready to hire for my team as well. It can be hard. I think that's the one thing from the pandemic and having everyone figure out that remote working can work. That greatly expands the pool you have for Drupal resources. Because I think before, I would say a majority of businesses were very regionally focused. And so you have a small, like in the Boston area, there's a relatively tight-knit group of Drupal developers in a Drupal ecosystem. And you see people constantly moving from different agencies and businesses. But now it's a bigger pool to choose from. It's still hard to find.
Right.
And like, how do you even measure who a good one is? There's like the Acquia certifications and whatnot. But is that that's like more marketing piece, or is it that actually proof of value?
So along that kind of couples with my question, right? My challenge of people leaving your team. Sometimes people leave for various reasons, but like, how do you, well, I mean, I don't know, this is probably a much bigger question, but like, how do you mitigate that from happening, right? How do you mitigate that challenge? But then also, like, what's the plan of action when that does happen?
Pay
Well,
them more.
Yeah, I was going to say that's my chance to plug myself. I mean, that's one of the things that I do is I serve as capacity, like overflow capacity. So sometimes an agency will have a developer move on a long-term project, and they'll hire me for 10 hours, 20 hours a week for 2-3 months, just to kind of fill that capacity while they fill the role. And it's kind of the same thing. Either you end up with 5 or 6 developers, you have developers just sitting there doing nothing just to kind of fill that space when somebody leaves, or you have to have something outside to fill that capacity when somebody leaves.
So I think that's
go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I think that's where having people who are less specialized is beneficial, because if you have that one person who is the themer and they leave and no one really knows how to pick that up, you're out of luck, and you have to hire someone like Nick, which would be beneficial to you, obviously, to hire Nick. However, if you have people who are you don't need someone who's a jack of all trades, but if you kind of mix the different skill sets between people, then you have a smaller gap that you have to fill. So it's easier for other people on the team to pick it up.
That actually reminds me I had a professor in college many years ago. I can say that now. And he used to have a company that relied pretty heavily on like on a production line. So he would have 8 or 10 people working on a product, and each person had one specific task. And he told me that one of the things that he did was that really helped his productivity is once a week, every person had to work on part of the line that they did wasn't their primary. So each person had a primary, like, your job is to reach in and twist this knob 3/4 of a turn. And they get very good at that, very quick at doing that. But once a week, or maybe once every 2 weeks or so, I don't know the exact change was, but they would rotate to another job. And now instead of reaching in to twist the knob, they have to pull a cap off or something. But what that meant was when somebody was out sick, it wasn't just that person that, twisted the knob, or they didn't have to pull somebody from another shift and be like, hey, you have to work a double today because so-and-so is out. They could just get anybody to fill that in and find out who's actually available to fill the shift. And the same is kind of true for development. Like, yeah, you don't have to have somebody. I'm not great at Java, unless it's Node. I'm not great at front-end JavaScript, but if I need to jump in and fix something or debug something, I can.
So if you need to fill a role on your team for front-end JavaScript, do not call Nick for that. That's not going to be something that he can help you with.
That is
figure it out. He just said he could figure it out.
So
yeah, that's one of my disclaimers. Like, if you want very inefficient front-end coding,
so one thing I want
to hire me.
Want to come back to, right? Steven said jokingly, pay more, right? And
wasn't a joke.
Well, that's not a joke.
No, it's not. Everybody should get paid what they're worth, what they feel they're worth, right? But my point there is that having regular check-ins with your team, we're not necessarily talking about the management of the team. We're talking about how to select it, but having regular check-ins with your team, making sure that, things are going well, they're happy is one way that you can potentially avoid having to deal with, dealing with replacing them. So
Good point, John.
Yeah, but also filling those gaps, paying more does help. I mean, people will jump ship for a better paycheck.
Sometimes pay isn't that important to people. But anyway.
So I pose each of you a question. You're going to build a Drupal project of X size. You can only hire 3 people. So you get a bare bones crew. Mike, what skills do you get in those 3 people?
For a Drupal project specifically, 3 people?
Project. Yep.
Technical architect, front-end developer, and project manager.
Okay. How about you, Nick?
Half of a project manager, technical architect, half a front-end guy, and a back-end developer.
Okay. Interesting way to slice it. How about you, John?
Well, now that I know we can go halvesies, I'm gonna.
Yeah, I didn't know we could cut people. I'm
gonna go with a project manager, and then a back-end developer / architect person, project lead, whatever you want to call that person, and then a front-end developer.
All right, I'm hiring 3 Nicks.
Well, unless you want front end work done.
Yeah. You want front end JS, your host.
I didn't say the site had to look good or work good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not the one thing I don't do flat out is design, but front end development, I can get it done in a pinch. It's just that's not my efficiency.
But I think that that question about, if we could hire only 3 people, that raises a question of how do you know when you have the right team? Right. And then from there, once you do have it, how do you grow that team in the right way? And have you guys, I'm going to guess John's heard this phrase, but for teams, there's 3 phases to a team. There's stormin', normin', and performin'. Have you guys heard that?
No.
Have you heard that, John?
No.
All right. So basically, when you form a new team together, they're storming. They don't know how to work together. They have to figure it out. So that's like an onset of a project. Say if you're hired for a client and you meet with their team and you have to integrate their team with yours, you have to figure out how to work together. You don't get too much done except for figuring out how the team's going to work. And then you have the norming phase where everyone's figuring out where skill sets lie, who does what work, how do you kind of divide it up. And the performance phase is then when the team can, you get a ticket in the backlog, you know exactly who it goes through, it moves through the process and you get it out pretty quickly. So, I think that's how you know when you have the right team, is that when you get to that phase, you know you have the right team. And if you're always in team fighting, you don't have the right team, and you have to figure out who's causing the problems, or talk to somebody, or bring somebody else on because you don't have enough people on. But it's getting to that norming phase.
I think you're also
performing phase.
You're also that's a great way of putting it, and I had not heard of that, so I'm going to start using that all the time now. But I also think it's looking at the team and seeing if they're running into the same problems over and over again, right? Because that can highlight knowledge gaps in your team, right? And give you the ability to say oh, hey, we need that front end JS guy because nobody on our team really knows that. We get by, but it always becomes, a time suck or it becomes something where we have to hire a contractor, right?
Yeah.
And that's another barometer. Looking at if you're hiring contractors all the time for the same thing, maybe you bring that person or somebody like that person on the team to avoid that cost.
Yeah, I mean the backlog can really help with that too, because seeing, for example, if the backlog just continues to grow, then you might need more resources. But you have to be careful because you can't just look, for example, at the types of tickets that are in the backlog, because sometimes, like I said, to pick on myself again, if there's a really important front end task, I'll take care of it. It's going to take me longer than it would take. Maybe I can knock out 3 back-end tasks in the length of time it takes me to knock out 1 front-end task, right? So you look at that backlog, you might look at that and be like, oh, there's a bunch of development backlog tasks. We need a developer. But, the truth is we just need a more efficient front-end developer that can take care of those high priority client-facing issues. And then, let the development person actually focus on the back-end tasks, and then, everything will be fine. So, some of it's monitoring the backlog, talking to the team, finding out what's causing the backlog to grow, what they need, and then providing those resources.
That's called having retrospectives.
So after this hour, it feels like to me the PM is the most important first position to get started on any project.
Yep.
Sounds like to me.
Yep.
So we can start storming, Norman, and what was that last one?
Performing.
Okay.
You remember
right.
storming Norman, but you couldn't
Yes.
remember performing. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I know who Stormin' Norman is, so that helps. If you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal. You can reach out to us on the Drupal channel, the Slack channel at Talking Drupal. Also email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. We do have a newsletter that does include the weekly show notes. You can sign up for that at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Sorry, I was just looking up who Stormin' Norman is. You can promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo. One word, camp promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com, choosing become a patron, and you'll get the first pre-show and post-show audio. And if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, Mike, how could they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Mike Miles86 or on any of the Drupal channels, Mike Miles86. Also, my podcast, developingup.com. You can contact me from there. Or I guess my personal website too, mike-miles.com.
Ooh, Dash Miles.
Yeah, Mike Miles is taken by some Canadian Taekwondo instructor, and I do not want to fight him for the domain, so I put the dash in there.
Makes a lot of sense. And Mike, thanks for joining us for the first of four.
Thanks for having me.
We're looking forward to the next couple of weeks. Stephen, where can everybody find you?
StephenCross.com.
There's no dash in that, right?
No
dash. Nick,
you want to fight me for it?
Nope, sure don't. Nick, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about Oomph at oomphinc.com. And again, we are hiring. So if you're looking for a job, go to oomphinc.com. You can see what we got open for you.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.